Well, we're going to head now to Tel Aviv. We can speak to Eylon Levy, who is a former international spokesperson for the Israeli government. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening.
What is your understanding of what Israel is seeking to achieve in southern Syria?
Israel is staging a humanitarian intervention here to protect the Druze minority in Syria. Israelis have been horrified in recent days to see images of Druze people being attacked by regime forces in Syria, including reports, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, of 21 extrajudicial executions. Now, Israel is a Jewish state, but it has a big Druze minority. They're a well-integrated part of society, and they're begging the government to do something to save their brothers across the border. In fact, we've seen hundreds of Druze men breaking into Syria to go and fight on behalf of their Druze brethren. So Israel here is trying to tell Jolani, back off, the Druze must be protected, and they're under our protection. We won't allow you to attack them.
The Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, calling on Damascus, quote, leave the Druze in Suwayda alone. He's then been firing drones, and there's been an airstrike on the military headquarters in Damascus. And I'm just wondering whether you think this is helpful in achieving that goal.
Well, Israel's trying to get the Jolani's forces to back off from attacking the Druze in southern Syria. Let's remember, Jolani was until recently an al-Qaeda terrorist until he trimmed his beard and put on a new suit. And Israel is very skeptical and wary. It's called him a wolf in sheep's clothing, hoping that he will want to be part of the circle of peace and normalization in the Middle East, but worrying that the leopard hasn't changed its spots. So I think by attacking the military headquarters in Damascus, Israel is sending a message to the Syrian military that it should pull back from Suwayda and stop attacking the Druze over there, and not just by attacking the forces once they're actually in Suwayda, but also sending a clear message to the military leadership that the Druze must be protected. And I think it's a positive development that in just the last few hours, we've seen a statement coming from the Syrian government, I think trying to calm things down and committing to the protection of Druze civilians, saying that that incident must be investigated, hoping, I hope, of course, that the civilians there will remain protected.
Yeah, I mean, you haven't mentioned one other part of the story, which is that the Syrian army went to Suwayda to try to put down clashes that have broken out between the Druze and Bedouin armed groups. I mean, that's the backstory, isn't it? That's what sparked this. I mean, the Syrian armed forces didn't go to Suwayda to attack Druze people, did they?
Well, I think there are two aspects here. The first is that the Druze people in Syria came under attack from Bedouin forces loyal to the regime. We've seen really horrific reports of human rights abuses taking place there. One senior Druze official in Israel saying this is, the Druze of Syria's 7th of October. But there is another region, which is that Israel wants southern Syria to be demilitarized. The lesson that Israel drew from October 7th is that it cannot allow hostile forces to amass on its border and hope that it can deter them or have advanced warning of an attack. So there are two interests. One, a humanitarian interest to protect the Druze of southern Syria, and the second, a desire to keep Jolani's forces away from the Israeli border in order to promote regional stability and make sure that we don't get those hostile forces amassing on Israel's border. Those two interests go hand in hand.
I mean, some might say, what business has Israel got dictating terms to a sovereign state on where it can and cannot have its soldiers in that country, especially when they say they're going there to put down clashes that have broken out. These are historic clashes. These are nothing new. The clashes between Bedouin armed groups and the Druze, they go back a long way, I'm told. I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, the public pressure in Israel for a humanitarian intervention is coming from the Druze community inside Israel. It's not coming from radical settlers or the far right. It's coming from the Druze minority in Israel, many of whom have family in southern Syria. And they've been watching the images on social media of the atrocities, and they're demanding action. They've declared a general strike. They've been protesting on the border. They've been blocking highways. We've had hundreds of Israeli Druze men breaking into Syria to go and fight, and the community leadership telling men to get ready and go and fight in Syria to protect their own brethren if that's needed. And the Druze are a very loyal minority inside Israel. They're punching way above their weight in the army, in the police force, in the civil service as well. And they're telling the Israeli government, we have stood by your side to help protect our country. Now we need you to come to the defense of our cousins across the border who are being slaughtered. And I think there are two aspects here. One, Israel as a Jewish state says we cannot allow a minority to be targeted just over the border and stand idly by. It goes against the soul of who we are. We know as Jews what it's like to be persecuted. But also, owing that debt of loyalty to the Druze community inside Israel, it can't stand idly by while their cousins are being slaughtered just across the border.
I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm recalling events only a week or so ago when Christians in the West Bank, who say they were coming under renewed and sustained attack from Israeli settlers, were calling for action. We had the patriarch, I think it was, of the Greek Orthodox Church there, saying that several sacred sites in the West Bank, Christian sacred sites, had been desecrated, vandalized. I mean, if Israel's goal is to defend religious minorities in the region, I mean, some might say perhaps it might look a little closer to home.
Yeah, well, I've seen those ghastly reports, and I certainly hope that they are investigated in full and that the perpetrators are held accountable. As far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely no excuse for that sort of vigilante violence. But that doesn't change the fact that there is a big domestic constituency inside Israel, within Druze society, that is demanding humanitarian protections for the Druze of Syria. And Israel looks at them and expects they need to be protected. And if Israel doesn't protect them, no one else is going to. And as I said, there's a confluence of interests. Israel wants to keep Syrian regime forces away from the border because it doesn't trust an army that is now run by an ex-al-Qaeda militant. But also the government is under significant domestic pressure to protect the Druze. And if the Israeli government were to decide to say, not our business, Jolani can do whatever he wants to the Druze of Syria, they would have a serious domestic problem from a large, very loyal minority group that is expecting the government to do something to protect their families across the border.
You mentioned the Syrian leadership on more than one occasion already, Mr. Levy, and President Ahmed al-Shara was the man who was embraced, let's not forget, only 2 months ago, quite literally, by President Donald Trump. I mean, are you suggesting he is not the right man for the job?
Well, President al-Shara was until recently on America's most wanted list. He was, America had a $5 million bounty, I think, on his head. He was only taken off the most wanted list once he started giving press conferences from the presidential palace in Damascus. He's a former al-Qaeda militant who now wears a suit and has trimmed his beard. Now, Israel hopes, of course, the leopard has changed its spots, that his focus now is to build Syria, to stabilize that country, and that he's not an Islamist who's looking for wars. But Israel is, of course, skeptical, and experience has shown that people like that should be treated with skepticism. Israel would like to have peace with Syria. We're seeing positive developments. The fall of the Assad regime has knocked Syria out of the Iranian axis. It stopped weapons smuggling to Hezbollah. We've had meetings between Jolani and senior Israeli officials. These are positive developments. But at the same time, Israel, I think, is right to suspect that he hasn't become, a Western liberal overnight, and that there are still serious Islamist inclinations in his government. And if we're going to have normalization, then the Syrian government is going to have to prove its peaceful intentions. And one way to prove its peaceful intentions is to make sure that all non-Muslim minorities in Syria are protected as well.
Mr. Levy, you've mentioned normalization, and I wanted to ask you about that in any case, because Israel expressed a desire to normalize ties with other countries in the region, and Syria was one of them. Lebanon could be another. And I'm just struggling to reconcile that kind of ambition and that kind of narrative with the airstrikes carried out on the heart of Damascus today. How do you reconcile that?
Israel wants the October 7th war to end with peace. And we're on the cusp of a historic breakthrough, normalization with Lebanon, with Syria, with Saudi Arabia that want to turn a new leaf, and that would be a fantastic development. But, peace is what happens when war ends. And Syria is still in a state of war with Israel because the Assad regime never recognized Israel. Now, there is a question about whether the attacks on the Druze civilians in Suwayda in fact pushes peace further away, because I think there are two options. Either Jolani is behind the persecution of Druze civilians in Suwayda, in which case many people in Israel, including Israeli Druze, will say, how can we make peace with a man who is persecuting our brethren across the border? Or they're being attacked by rogue forces. And then there's the question, how can you have a border security arrangement with a country that can't even control its own forces? Maybe Jolani isn't as secure in power in Syria as he would hope. But in any case, we're hearing the American administration trying to calm down the temperatures and get normalization back on track. And I hope we will be able to have peace and normalization with Syria, and that it will be a peace that's based on the protection of minority rights in Syria as well.
I just want to pick up on that point just one more time about the president of Syria. And I'm hearing from you a sense that you think the United States has been either naive or hasty or both to welcome President Bashar in from the cold, essentially. I mean, is that what you think?
I think the United States has a clear interest to try to draw Syria into the Western orbit, because the alternative, having just kicked out the Russians, is that Syria ends up in China's orbit. There is, of course, a scramble now for influence inside Syria. The Turks, the Qataris are also trying to gain influence, and it's important for the United States to draw them into the Western orbit and help to make peace. But one does have to wonder whether the decision to lift sanctions on Syria was a little bit too hasty, because the United States was not demanding that the new regime prove anything or meet any specific goals and targets. It was unconditional. And I hope that Jolani, who used to be an HTS al-Qaeda militant, really has changed his stripes and is committed to moderation. And this isn't a big deception ruse to try to trick the West. But I think Israel is going to treat him with caution, fear the worst, and hope for the best.
And when it comes to the Druze, I mean, they don't all speak with one voice, do they? So when Israel says it wants to protect this minority, which they are, as only 1.2 million Druze in the entire Middle East region, that's according to estimates. Is there a risk that perhaps Israel is doing many of the Druze a disservice by framing them as being a protected people by Israel, which may cause them other problems in a region where, a lot of countries have not normalized ties with Israel?
You're right, the Druze don't speak in one voice. They're a minority group that has always been loyal to the countries they live in, and now they find themselves under attack in Syria. But as I said, the demand to protect the Druze is coming from Druze inside Israel. And I'm sure that if they thought that demanding intervention to protect their cousins in Suwayda were going to put them in further trouble, they wouldn't do that. Instead, they're demanding that Israel help them, that they protect them, because they think that that's what's best for their cousins over the border. And I'm sure they have a better idea of what's good for the Druze in Syria, better than either you or I have.
I mean, there are people who, even at the outset of the beginning of the end of Bashar al-Assad's rule in Syria, who saw, incursions by Israeli forces into Syrian territory, and they saw this as opportunism. And there may be people who are out there saying they're getting involved in the plight of the Druze in southern Syria, close to Israel's border and close to the Golan Heights, is again an attempt to divide and conquer and foment unrest. What do you say to that?
Israel doesn't want to divide and conquer, but it does want to keep hostile forces away from its border. The lesson that Israel learned from the October 7th massacre is that we're just too small and just too vulnerable to allow enemy forces to sit on the border and then hope that we'll receive an advance warning before they attack. It failed in Gaza, where we were invaded by thousands of Hamas terrorists on October 7th. They brutally murdered 1,200 people. It allowed Hezbollah to build an arsenal of over 100,000 missiles. And Israel is now using its moment of strength, having largely won the October 7th war, to promote regional stability by pushing threats away from the border. It's saying we can't let those threats build up on our border and then hope we can deter them. In order to keep ourselves safe and then to prevent the risk of conflict, we need to push hostile forces away from the border. So there's definitely a question whether supporting the Druze in Syria is a question of overreach, overextension, whether Israel is biting off more than it can chew. But Israel's strategic understanding has definitely shifted. We can't allow jihadi forces to sit along the border to create a jihadi safe haven and just hope that things will be okay. Israel now says we learned the hard way what happens when hostile forces build up on our border, and we can't let them get anywhere close to Israeli civilians again.
I mean, just the geography has to be, we have to remind our viewers that Suwayda is not really very far from Damascus. So the idea of there being no Syrian forces close to the capital is a bit unrealistic, isn't it? It's only about 40 kilometers away from the Syrian capital, Damascus.
Exactly. Suwayda is not very far from Damascus, and Damascus isn't very far from Israel. Israel's a very small country, and these forces are in very close proximity. And Israel has no strategic depth. What it is doing now, by helping to protect the Druze civilians who want that support inside Syria, is to make sure that hostile forces can't approach the border. And so, as I said, these two interests go hand in hand. On the one hand, Israel's strategic understanding of how to promote regional stability and to forestall conflict by keeping threats away from the border, and a genuine humanitarian impulse under domestic pressure from Druze in Israel to protect Druze civilians. I think Israel would rather see southern Syria be some sort of Druze autonomous region or an area where the Druze are able to protect themselves than to have the forces under control of an ex-al-Qaeda commander in charge of this vulnerable religious minority.
And yet these hostile forces that you're talking about are the forces of a government with which Israel does not exclude and possibly even welcomes the idea of a normalization of ties. It's very difficult to join all the dots there.
Not at all. I mean, these are hostile forces because they're forces of a government that remains at a state of war with Israel. If that government makes peace with Israel, then they won't be hostile forces. They'll be friendly. But that's why we need a diplomatic process to promote normalization between Israel and Syria. And I hope that all international diplomats and world leaders say it's a once-in-a-lifetime historic opportunity now to promote peace and normalization in the Middle East, because everything has changed in the wake of the October 7th war.
Sure, I mean, a lot has changed, that's absolutely unquestionable. And one of the significant issues with regards to this particular matter is the fact that the Syrian government is very much in the fold now, it would appear, of the Trump administration, of other regional allies. Israel is, of course, an ally as well. What's Washington, just to wrap up, what does Washington make of Israel's incursions into Syria and these latest developments? Have we heard anything yet?
The latest report that I've seen from Axios is that Washington is trying to cool the temperatures. It wants a de-escalation. Of course, as part of that, it will want the Syrian government to commit to protections of the Druze minority and all other minorities inside Syria. But I think President Trump has an agenda now. He wants to get peace and normalization in the Middle East. He wants that to be his legacy. And so they're going to want to try to de-escalate in order to promote those peace agreements. But as I said, given the domestic pressure from the Druze inside Israel, peace with Syria is only going to be possible if the Druze are protected. Israel won't be able to normalize relations with Syria if it's persecuting the Druze in Suwayda at the same time.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. A pleasure talking to you, Eylon Levy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.